video, we're going to start with a photograph and then draw over it to create a cartoon character that we could use in a game. I'm going to begin with this photograph of an ostrich. It's a stock photo. The first thing I'm going to do is just scale the image down a little bit because it's actually a much higher resolution photograph than I need. And I'm going to take it from its initial width, which right here is 5400 or so times 3600, and I'll reduce it by 50% for my draw over. And I'll probably reduce it again further when I'm finally done and ready to put it in game. But that first step will just be to drop it down so that the drawing response will be a little bit faster on my computer. Now, what I'm going to do is take this photo layer and I'm going to create a new layer on top of it that I'm going to use for my drawing. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways that you can approach doing this drawing. So first I'm going to go down here and click the button to create a new layer, and I'll hit plus to zoom in a little bit to begin doing the drawing. And let's call this layer, instead of layer 2, let's call this sketch layer 1. So one way that I could go about trying to do this would be to very carefully draw an outline all the way around everything in my background layer. I have a pencil brush selected with a time curve setting right here. So I'm using the pencil 2B, and I've used the time curve to adjust the thickness of my brush, but you could use whichever brush you feel like using. So I could go around and do my drawing like so. There are a couple limitations to this. So one of them is that with the background image that I have, in some places it's awfully hard for me to see what I'm doing because I'm drawing with a black brush over some areas that are pretty dark. Another thing that's kind of tough with this is that the outline of this particular photograph is not very clear because of all the feathers. So figuring out how to actually draw this exactly like the background is actually not that easy to do. And the end result, may be good, but even if I'm trying to be very faithful to the image that I have in the photograph, it may not come out looking exactly the way that I want. Let's have a look at what that looks like so far. And you can see I've gotten like a little bit of background, but it doesn't, a little bit of the image outline, but it doesn't really have the character of that ostrich. One thing I will do right away before I go on any further is I'm going to make a solid background layer that I can use instead of just the transparency, so that I can see my sketch over a solid color. So I'm going to go down here to the new layer button and choose a fill layer, and I'll choose a kind of a 50% gray to use as that color. I'm going to call this one background gray and just drag that down to the bottom of my layer stack so that I can always have that available and see what this looks like. So you can see already my outline doesn't really look all that great over the background, even though I've been trying to pretty faithfully follow the outline of my photograph. So I'm going to show you a different way of going about this, which is instead of to try to follow the outline exactly, to try to really sketch out the underlying shapes of the photograph and then build up that on top of that as a template. And this will also give me the advantage that I can have a little bit more control over what you might call exaggerating or giving some artistic license to the image, making it more of a cartoony image if I want to do that, or giving it the kind of a little more control over giving it a certain kind of a look or personality. So I'll make a new layer for this, and I'm going to call this one sketch layer 2. I'll go ahead and hide sketch layer 1, so I'm starting over right for this. Another thing that I'm going to do is change my colors up a little bit. So instead of trying to draw with black against the full color photograph, I'm going to take my background photo and I'm going to make it kind of like a monochrome background that I can draw over. And that I think will make it a little bit easier to see my strokes in the first place. I'm going to right click on that layer and choose duplicate layer or mask so that I have that as a copy. I'll hide my original one, and then I'll take this layer, copy of layer 1, and we'll go up to the filter menu and go to the adjust filters. I'll choose HSV adjustment. I'm going to click colorize, and then I can pick a hue and a saturation amount. So the hue will change the color of the overall image, and I'll give it this kind of like a teal, green, blue. And then bring up the saturation. We'll control how much that colorization effect has. And by bringing up the lightness, I can give myself a slightly easier image to draw over. So I can still see the overall shapes, but my pen strokes will be a lot more visible. If I want to make them even more visible, instead of drawing with black, like so, I could choose a different color, like drawing with red. I don't have to keep that color in the final image. Of course, I can draw with red, and then I can change that sketch layer over from red to black, or do another drawing layer on top of that if I want later on. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, and then start drawing over this. So instead of trying to draw all the outlines, I want to look at this shape and see if I can think about what the underlying shapes actually are here. So the eyeballs, for example, to begin with. So here we obviously have, some circles, some spheres underneath here. I can make the size a little bit smaller. And I'm not trying to make this precise. I'm going to make this really very sketchy. Each line is going to just be like a lot of very small lines that I'm going to use to build up and kind of try to find the overall form here. The eyelids coming out like so are definitely a very strong feature. And then thinking about the shape of the head, you can think of that as being like one big oval right here, and then there's a shape coming out here for the cheeks, and then this sort of shape for the beak. All right, so now looking at that sketch layer, I think that's a pretty good starting point. Now what I could do is go over that with something more like an ink brush and get another layer with a cleaner line on it. I'm going to make a new layer called layer 5, and let's call this one ink. I'll take my sketch layer, and again I can go and do a HSV adjustment to that. To find a different color that might be a little bit easier to draw over. So I'm going to put this into a kind of a very light blue, drop down the saturation a little bit, like so, and then use that to draw over with the ink. For my ink layer, I'll go ahead and turn the foreground color back to black, and then I'll go up to my brushes, brush options over here, and find another brush that would give me like a nice nice kind of an ink brush. So I'll pick this one, Ink Brush 25. In the settings, again, I'm going to, I think, use the time settings. To control the size. So you can see over time it will kind of thin out like that. So I can, I think, use this to get some nice variability into the look of my ink strokes. I'm also going to go over here and turn on the stabilizer. So that'll give me like a nice smooth curve with each of these ink strokes. All right, so starting that off, I think that I've got that time setting a little bit too steep. So let's bring that up a little bit, like here, so it's more like 7 seconds, because I'm going to be drawing fairly slowly with this. And I'm going to bring the initial size down. All right, so now we can see what that ink layer looks like just by itself, with the sketching removed. And then the final thing that we could do is go in and add another layer to fill in color. To color in this drawing, I've created another layer called Fill, and I'm using one of the bristle brushes. I'm using the bristle tapered brush, which just gives like a nice little bit of texture to the painting. But you can use just a regular round brush or one of the other brushes, whichever one you like. You can see here in the fill layer, I've dropped down a couple of color swatches for colors I'm going to use for this paint layer, and I can quickly pick from those colors by holding down, I think it's Control on Windows and Command on the Mac, and that will bring up the color picker tool very quickly to let you choose, select a color from the background. So that way I can set up this set of swatches and pick those colors. So I'm just going to go quickly through the process of going and filling this in. All right, now the texture brush that I used creates a really nice kind of painterly, or maybe at least chalk or pastel looking style right here. However, it doesn't fill everything in. So one of the things that we will need to do before we finish off this painting is get in some additional fill underneath some of these areas. Because remember, I have this temporary background layer, the background gray, turned on right now. And if I turn that off, you can now see that there is some transparency showing through in a number of spots in this painting, where I haven't filled it in entirely in the fill layer. So we will need to go ahead and fix that as well. Let's go back to the my regular paintbrush again, and let's see, where did that bristle go? Here we are. I'll go back to my bristle taper brush, fill in just a little bit of stuff right here. That I need to clean up on my main layer. And then I'm going to make one more fill layer underneath this. All right, so at this point, I think the image looks pretty good. And so from here, we clean this up a little bit by cropping the image down just to this area, resize it to the size that we need for the game, and then export it as a PNG.